Bonsoir, excusez-moi que je vais parler anglais. Malheureusement, j'ai oublié la plupart de mon français.
Bernard,
Je pensais que c'est complètement détruit, mais ça commençait de revenir chez moi quand j'étais à la prison de Luhansk, à la russe captivité. Mais, euh, mais j'ai oublié la plupart. C'est difficile de parler, j'ai honte de parler. Alors, je vais continuer en anglais.
okay.
So good evening, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak, and thank you very much for taking the initiative to talk about Ukraine and the challenges. My name is Maksym Boutkevytch, and before the year 2022, human rights were at the very core of everything I have done in previous 15 years or more than that. I was called a human rights defender by my colleagues and by other people. And to me, human rights is something very essential. And this was one of the reasons why, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine at the end of February 2022, I joined the armed forces of Ukraine because I dealt with issues, among other things, related to rights of refugees and asylum seekers in Ukraine, mostly from former Soviet countries, including Russia. And I was in contact with human rights defenders in Russia, so I understood pretty well the situation with human rights in Russian Federation. I understood quite well that human rights do not mean anything in the contemporary Russian ideology, and that there will be no human rights activism or human rights defense or human rights as something valuable in the territories occupied by Russia. So I realized for myself, if I am called a human rights defender, then I should defend human rights in Ukraine by the means available to me. Unfortunately, at that time, the only mean available was to take up arms and resist Russian aggression. And therefore, I joined the armed forces of Ukraine also as a human rights defender. In the military, me and my brothers in arms, we took part in liberation of Kyïv region from Russian occupation in springtime of 2022. But unfortunately, in 3 months and a half, I was captured together with 8 of my brothers in arms by Russian military, and next 2 years and 4 months I spent in Russian captivity. Within some period of time, for my captors, it was not enough to keep me as a prisoner of war, as a POW, and they decided to fabricate a criminal case against me, accusing me of war crimes, and force me to sign a confession. And in March of 2023, I was sentenced by the so-called court to the 13 years of penal colony of strict regime. And I was released, I was liberated in October 2024 as a part of prisoner exchange. Within these 2 years and 4 months, I was kept with different people. I was with other Ukrainian prisoners of war. I was with, after I was convicted, I was kept with those accused of criminal offenses. We were mixed together after the sentence. Before that, we were kept in a separate wing of prison in Luhansk. No regular inmates were allowed into that part of the prison. But among other people who were kept with me, there were civilians who were mostly not accused of anything, but were put there under so-called preventive arrest. The preventive arrest meant that these people were not, as I said, accused of anything in particular, but they, before, at some point of time in their lives, either served in Ukrainian military or worked at the national police forces or were part of systems of local self-governance, like village councils. All of these people were suspicious to the occupying authorities, and therefore they were put under arrest incommunicado. Their relatives were not informed on their whereabouts. They didn't know where they are, and they were kept, some of them at least, together with Ukrainian prisoners of war. What was common to all of us, including, in the first place, civilian detainees, that no matter what were the circumstances under which they were arrested or detained, they all went through torture. They all went through physical and psychological pressure, some of them under horrendous pressure, really. And it didn't take long to realize that these are not isolated incidents. The torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, when it comes to Ukrainian prisoners of war, but also to civilian detainees, are a system imposed by Russia on the occupied territories to inflict the atmosphere of fear and distrust, and to threaten everyone living on the occupied territories not to make moves which would be considered wrong by the occupying authorities. It was very obvious to understand that Russian authorities not only try to threaten all the population of occupied territories, but also that its efforts to undermine the very notion of human rights, of international humanitarian law, and the very concepts of human dignity and human agency are part of the consistent policy and are part of contemporary ideology of the so-called Russian world. And we have all just been witnesses to that. You know, when one looks up in the dictionary the definition of occupation, it is always about control of a territory. But this territory is populated by hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of people. And in order to control territory and its resources, these people are turned into objects to be manipulated, to be threatened, to be put into compliance, and effectively, when it's needed, turned into hostages. Because from my experience, everyone in the occupied territory can find him or herself in detention. It doesn't really matter whether they have done anything or not for that. And when currently we hear talks about negotiations, about peace negotiations, or negotiations related to the possible curfew or peace agreement, or whatever they are called, what really worries me is that human component of this topic is largely omitted, while effectively we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, of Ukrainians who are effectively held hostage by Russian occupying power, and Russian occupying power treats them with complete disregard to international rules, to international humanitarian law, and when necessary, puts in detention as many as they like. I was fortunate. I spent in captivity only 2 years and 4 months, and I have not been tortured in a way some of people whom I have met in captivity have been. This is why I feel it's my obligation to talk about them, about those who are still in captivity and those who find themselves in captivity. They are very different people, from a local taxi driver in Luhansk to officers of Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. With two of them, I was held in penal colony and they were convicted on fabricated charges. Currently, one of them serves his time near Omsk in deep Siberia, another one in Chelyabinsk in western Siberia. Ukraine tries to release civilians as much as possible. Only last year we have witnessed, if I'm not mistaken, more than 200 civilians being released in different negotiation and exchange processes, but we talk about thousands who still remain in captivity and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of those who are still hostages. And this is why, to me, human component and humanitarian component is something which should be placed at the very core of any peace negotiations, any peace talks, any negotiations about the curfew. As someone who experienced Russian captivity firsthand and how it works and what kind of pressure can be put upon any individual inmate and how complete is disregard of international humanitarian law demonstrated by the Russian authorities, I should say that release of all civilian detainees and exchange of all prisoners of war should be not the result of peace negotiations, but the precondition to it, which would show as well how seriously Russia takes peace talks. If they do not agree to this release, it means they basically are not serious about negotiating peace. But also when we hear talks about Ukraine giving up its territories in exchange for peace, to be honest, I have problems with that. Not even because of territorial integrity, but because in the first place, understanding that Russia does not need currently occupied territories of Ukraine. Russia does not need more territories. It doesn't know what to do with its own territory. It's too big. Russia's aim is destruction of Ukraine as an independent entity and imposement of its own ideology where human being is nothing and authoritarian state is everything. This is Russia's goal in genocidal war against Ukraine. But the second, no less important reason to be skeptical about these demands, territories in exchange for peace, is that these territories are populated. They are not desert. They are living habitat of so many people who are effectively turned by occupation into hostages of the occupying power, which acts with complete disregard of international law, of any humanitarian norms, of everything we've been working for last dozens of years to ensure, as imperfectly as it is, observation of human rights and civil liberties. And while remembering about these people, we need to keep them in mind when we talk about any peace or any curfew. And this is what I would like to emphasize at the end of this my address. Thank you very much for your attention.